It was only a jest, she reminded herself, releasing a faint laugh, as if coaxing the moment to rewind itself. But no one echoed her response, not the host, nor Caroline Levitt, and certainly not the man in the third row whose fingers were interlocked tightly, his stare fixed on her as though the ticking of the clock had stalled mid-second. Jasmine hadn't seen him yet, not yet. Her smile hovered, artificial and brittle, a feeble mask raised against the hush now spilling across the studio. She attempted to dismiss it, to treat the tension as a fleeting hiccup, one of those unscripted, ephemeral lapses that live television is famous for, but no one was playing along. Caroline didn't look her way, didn't glance toward the lens. Her eyes shifted instead to the far edge of the desk, lingered where her fingertips drummed twice, then grew still. A stifling stillness settled over the room, not loud, but suffocating, like a glass veil stretched so finely and densely that it could cradle a feather before shattering beneath its weight. Before we dive in, let us know where you're tuning in from, and don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next story. The prompt rolled out, trying to reset the rhythm. The audience wasn't hostile, at least not yet. They floated in an uncertain pause, caught between the shimmer of stage lights and a moment that had lurched off script with startling velocity, like a vehicle swerving without warning. Until that point, Jasmine Crockett had been in absolute command. She dictated the flow. She captivated the space. Her words were like invisible rain, shaping the rhythm, guiding the crowd, cupping them in her palm. Even James Whittaker, the seasoned stalwart of live broadcast, inclined subtly toward her, as if drawn by her gravitational pull. But then came a shift, not loud, not flamboyant, just a quiet tremor, as though something sacrosanct had been brushed by accident. The room didn't speak, but the atmosphere thickened with mutual apprehension, eyes darted, breath stalled, a silence too heavy to break. The camera swept sideways, its focus reoriented. A technician lifted a hand to signal something, but no one seemed to know what. Caroline remained wordless, and in the third row, the man in the slate-gray suit, with a discreet pin shaped like a mason's hammer, sat unmoving. Not listed among the invitees, not publicly acknowledged, yet his presence had begun to seep into the room like ink soaking slowly through paper. And with each quiet breath he drew, measured, deliberate, he seemed to alter the very resonance of the words just spoken. The question no longer hovered around, did Jasmine cross a line? It had transformed into, is she even aware of who is watching her? What you were witnessing was a dialogue slipping away from the hands that thought they were steering it. And the deeper question wasn't about right or wrong, it was, can we sit still long enough to hear what no one else has dared to articulate? The afternoon had been choreographed to precision, the live broadcast of American Currents, aired straight from a Chicago studio, before more than 200 spectators bathed in studio lights, clustered around boom mics, cued laughter, and invisible expectations. It was polished, professional. And that was precisely why Jasmine felt untouchable. She stepped from the backstage curtain triumphant, navy blazer sharp as a blade, hair pulled back with military precision, eyes alert and gleaming, her smile untouched by a flicker of doubt. She didn't seem to witness the stage. She seemed to command it. In her opening cadence, Jasmine dictated the rhythm. She spoke of narratives with crisp wit and paused expertly to allow the audience's chuckles to bloom. When James Whittaker posed a question about the growing rift among the younger generation, Jasmine merely shrugged. Some are raised on ideals. Others are born at the finish line. The audience roared, applause, head nods, murmurs of agreement swelling into confidence. Caroline sat beside her, saying nothing. Dressed in a high-collared cream blouse, bare of adornment. She offered no rebuttal, no interruption, didn't even shift in her posture. James leaned in. Caroline, what's your view on that? Her reply was clipped, that wasn't meant for me. The room hushed. Jasmine's grin returned, as though she'd scored the first decisive point. From the outset, Jasmine had the floor. The cameras clung to her presence. James appeared to echo her talking points. The crowd, whether out of curiosity or alignment, seemed more alive when Jasmine spoke, and she sensed it. She pushed forward. She spoke faster, added a sharper tone. Some folks get invited onto TV not for substance, but because they're young, telegenic, and parroting what their producers want. Kidding, of course, she said with a coy smile. But no laughter followed. Caroline offered a smile in return, her eyes flickering briefly. I think we all recognize a jest when we hear one, right? She offered. Silence. The camera swept, perhaps accidentally, past the third row. There sat Caroline's father, Bill Levitt. Simple gray attire. The hammer pin glinting. An emblem of his years laboring on construction crews back in Illinois. His gaze fixed on Jasmine. Not enraged, but electric. Jasmine still hadn't caught on. She pressed forward, her tone unshaken. Sometimes people ascend not from merit, but because they complete a vision someone else wants to display. The words were light in tone, but cut with surgical precision. James Whittaker released an uneasy chuckle, reaching for a topic change. Let's talk about young women entering politics, Jasmine, he pivoted, his voice a strained bomb. Caroline didn't respond. She stared at the table. Fingers woven. Her gaze found her father's. Bill remained still, but his presence loomed like thunder before the storm. She could feel the echo of his lessons. You don't inherit your place. You prove you belong there. Jasmine's line, though tossed off with a grin, had struck a nerve still raw. The audience began to perceive a shift, something subtle, yet undeniable. Applause that had once been steady now stuttered midair. A man leaned forward, hunched over his phone, perhaps to confirm he hadn't hallucinated what had just transpired on stage. James Whittaker bent over his notes, scanning the familiar lines as if hunting for a back door out of a play that had wandered beyond its boundaries. But the cameras held their focus. The lens refused, almost defiantly, to linger on the elderly man seated in the third row. Impeccably dressed in a gray suit, hair the shade of silver dust, features lined with quiet decades. Every detail about him, though seemingly incidental, became a mirror, one the studio hadn't noticed until now. And Jasmine Crockett began to understand. The smile remained, but wavered, stripped of its former certainty. She glanced at Caroline, then slowly took in the audience. When her gaze reached the man, unfamiliar, yet oddly significant, she felt as though she'd unknowingly breached some sacred threshold, and there was no path backward. No voices answered her. No cues. No soft music to wrap the silence. Only a piercing stillness, thin as glass and equally sharp, that made Jasmine's earlier remark ring with an uncomfortable weight. What had once sounded like polished banter now resembled a reckoning, one she hadn't expected, and certainly hadn't invited. The camera returned to her again and again, as though waiting for the moment to play itself out fully. James Whittaker, in fairness or habit, still leaned slightly toward her viewpoint. And the audience, whether drawn by intrigue or affinity, continued to react more often when Jasmine spoke. Their subtle encouragement urged her forward. Her voice hastened, her remarks flying faster, thinly veiled barbs wrapped in polished euphemisms. People are often chosen to go on air not for insight, but because they fit the part, they're young, attractive, and say the things the culture wants to hear. No one was named. But everyone knew. And Caroline knew better than all. She turned to Jasmine, not in anger, not even in protest, and calmly set her pen down on the glass table. The movement was deliberate, measured, like a quiet preface to a storm yet to unfold. At that very moment, the camera once more glided across the crowd, pausing for a blink on the third row. No one seemed to notice. Not even Jasmine. Another question followed, this time on how media constructs the image of women in politics. James tossed it out lightly, still in search of laughter, hoping to steer the ship back to familiar waters. Jasmine, have you ever felt misread simply for being a woman? She didn't miss a beat. Naturally. But more often, I'm misread because I refuse to apologize for telling the truth. Applause followed, brief but genuine. A young woman nodded. A man typed rapidly into his phone. And still, something in the air frayed at the edges. Not disagreement exactly, but a creeping sense that something wasn't sitting right anymore. Jasmine's poise began to take on a chill. Her gaze strayed more often, no longer fixed on James, but drifting toward Caroline, as though measuring the continued weight of her silence. Caroline said nothing. But attention drifted. Not toward Jasmine. Not even to Caroline. But to one presence. A presence without a microphone, without spotlight, without name card. He was simply there. On American Currents, everything had its place, the loud remarks, the subtle glances, the orchestrated applause, the unscripted lines. And everything followed its rhythm, until Jasmine offered one more remark. A line she believed was still hers to control. She laughed, secure in her command of the moment. Unaware that a man just below her gaze had finally looked up. And from that moment on, the story no longer belonged to her. James redirected. A new prompt, broad, safe. Jasmine, how do you respond to those who say they aren't being heard in today's political world? She leaned forward, fingers clasped, voice soft and tempered. I believe everyone has the right to feel neglected. But sometimes I wonder, is it true neglect, or is it that the road has already been laid, and it still doesn't feel like enough? A few laughed, not from humor, but from vindication. Caroline frowned. She stared down at the table, lips pressed together. Jasmine pressed on. At times, people enter politics not from conviction, but because they fit the moment, they match the message, match the campaign, match the image the media wants to showcase. Not because of skill, but because they were chosen while young. Her tone was casual, almost dismissive. Then came the soft chuckle. Of course, I'm only teasing. There was a half-laugh from the audience. James paused, clearly adrift. He forced a polite grin and turned toward Caroline. Caroline, your thoughts? Caroline looked at Jasmine, for a long, measured beat. Then her eyes moved to the crowd. And at last, the camera settled. For the first true time, it captured him. The older man in the third row. Bill Levitt. Caroline's father. His gaze never left Jasmine. His posture still rigid, his back never fully resting against the chair. His hands rested calmly on his knee. No fidgeting. No fury. Just presence. A silence so precise, so piercing, it could be held in the hand. Jasmine sensed it. Not clearly. But viscerally. A small laugh escaped her, part jest, part armor. I know I can be a bit blunt sometimes. But honestly, I think this country could stand to be a little less touchy. This time, no reaction. No applause. No chuckle. No movement from the rows closest to the stage. Caroline sat straight, rigid. Her eyes never once moved toward James or Jasmine. She looked only at Bill. As if asking him silently, what now? The camera returned to James. He stood there, hollow-eyed. There was no backup plan. Nothing in the rundown had accounted for a joke landing so hard it fractured the room. Jasmine's breathing grew shallow. And she began to feel it, not because anyone stood to correct her. But precisely because no one did. And in that quiet, everything had shifted. Then Caroline spoke, but not to Jasmine. Her voice was soft, almost incidental. My father is in the audience today. The room turned, as if summoned by gravity, toward the third row. Bill did not move. No nod. No acknowledgement. Only stillness, so complete it felt like a force. Jasmine turned, too. Her eyes met his. No one could measure how long they stayed locked, but for Jasmine, it felt like falling through space without anchor, without rescue. James Whittaker remained frozen. Maybe he understood. Maybe he didn't. But he said nothing. And sometimes, silence speaks with more precision than words ever could. Caroline placed her hand on the table, not to gesture, not to invite notice, but as though to ground something beginning to stir inside her. Something she was no longer willing to repress. I grew up in a household where my father was questioned nearly every day. What have you done to deserve that position? Her voice was composed, deliberate. And when he answered that he'd labored all his life, they would respond. But you don't have the right connections, do you? No applause. No murmurs of sympathy. No ambient music to cushion the moment. Just her voice, measured, steady. Not loud, but each sentence dropped like a nail driven straight into the heart of the air. So today, when someone mocks the idea of earned opportunity, right in front of my father, perhaps they believe it's a harmless joke. But for us, it's a wound. And it never closed. Jasmine did not interrupt. She didn't argue. She simply looked at Caroline, as though trying to peer through the words into something deeper, something truer. Caroline leaned forward slightly, perhaps intending to say more. But the camera had already moved on. It no longer clung to faces or favor. It now captured what was happening between people in the room. The audience was no longer watching a performance. They were becoming part of something else. Not an argument. But a reckoning. A moment of mutual understanding neither scripted nor expected. A question hovered unspoken among them. If I laughed, thinking it was just a joke, did I help keep that wound from ever healing? Bill Levitt didn't move. Didn't look away. Didn't lean back. His hands rested calmly on his knees. His posture upright. His presence unmoving but impossibly loud. No anger. No emotion that could be named. Just the unbearable stillness of being seen. And Jasmine felt it. Whatever it was. Vague, elusive, but undeniable. She laughed, sharp, brittle, too loud. An attempt at reclaiming the moment. Yes, I can be blunt, she said. But perhaps we Americans ought to learn not to be so thin-skinned. This time, nothing. No laughter. No gestures of support. Not a breath of affirmation from the front rows. Only that same stillness, now heavier than ever. A silence that made her words echo in ways she hadn't foreseen. Caroline remained silent. She didn't look at Jasmine. Not even at James. Her gaze was fixed, unblinking, on her father. She stared at him as if asking silently, with every conflicting thought in her heart, what do I do now? The camera returned to James. He stood like a man misplaced, unmoored in his own show. No script had predicted this moment. No briefing had warned of a room going completely still, not over fury, but over a joke that had ceased to be funny. Jasmine inhaled, lightly, uneasily. She was beginning to feel it. Not because she had been confronted. But because no one had. And because that silence had changed the weight of everything. It rose, as if from the floorboards. It spread, like water seeping through cracks. Caroline spoke again, but not to Jasmine. The words the same. The tone, resolute. My father is in the audience today. The crowd's attention shifted once more to the third row. Bill sat unchanged. No motion. No visible response. Jasmine turned. Her eyes found his again. No one could say how long the moment lasted. But to her, it felt infinite, like tumbling downward, with no ledge to grasp. And for the first time that evening, Jasmine said nothing. James made no move. Perhaps he understood what this was. Perhaps he didn't. Caroline's hand rested on the table, not as a signal, but as a brace. I come from a family where my father was asked, daily, what makes you worthy of that job? And when he said he worked construction for decades, they told him, but you don't know the right people, do you? No sound interrupted. No reaction dared to fill the room. So when someone reduces opportunity to a joke, right here, in front of my father, maybe they believe it's all in fun. But for us, it's an old wound. And it never healed. No tears. No raised voice. Just her gaze, steady. Words falling into the hush like stones into still water. Jasmine shifted forward, as if ready to speak. But the camera no longer held her. For just a few seconds, its lens drifted. And in those few seconds, everything else stopped. The audience was no longer part of the show. They were part of something else. A pause. A presence. A reckoning that could not be undone. Each listener was asking themselves. If I laughed once, thinking it harmless, did I help keep that wound open? The atmosphere had changed. Not through shouting. Not from conflict. But because the camera chose to stay. It remained fixed on Bill Levitt. And Jasmine finally saw him. Truly saw him. He didn't avert his eyes. Didn't smirk. Didn't offer anger. He simply looked. And in that look, every excuse, it was only a joke. People are too sensitive. I didn't mean anyone specifically. Evaporated into thin air. They didn't need to be refuted. They simply didn't survive. Jasmine's fingers curled slightly over the edge of the glass table. She had been combative before, had sparred with interviewers, navigated tough conversations. But now, she didn't know where to turn. She looked to James. He was staring downward, either reading lines or avoiding her gaze. The atmosphere inside the studio was altered. Not louder. Just heavier. As though gravity had grown stronger. So quiet now, each gesture seemed to ripple. The gentle tap of Caroline's pen against the glass table, faint, nearly imperceptible, echoed like a knock on a door no one dared approach. Then Bill stood. No preamble. No creak of the chair. Just a steady hand pressing against his knee, a subtle lean forward. And he was on his feet. Calm. Unshaken. The room seemed to exhale all at once. Jasmine edged backward, not out of fear, but because she couldn't read what response the moment demanded. He didn't approach the platform. Didn't step away. He merely stood. Hands resting at his sides. Eyes still on her. Not blaming. Not beseeching. But carrying something that had to be reckoned with. No words were required. None would have sufficed. Because his stillness, his sheer presence, was thunder in disguise. The audience began to stir. Some looked sideways at the people beside them, as if seeking silent agreement for a sensation they couldn't name. The feeling that something unspoken had surfaced, undeniable and raw. A production assistant leaned toward James, whispering. Perhaps about timing, perhaps about salvaging structure. But no one shifted. And the camera remained, unwavering, fixed on the scene unfolding. Bill's face, etched by time, silver hair glowing under studio lights. Didn't wear disapproval. It simply existed. A mirror, reflecting back what few dared to see. Jasmine saw it. She turned toward Caroline. And for the first time, the conflict between them fell away. They were no longer adversaries, no longer speaking from opposite ends. They were simply two women, seated in the presence of a father. Each with a story. Each with a silence. And in that shared hush, Jasmine thought of her own father. Not to draw parallels, but to remember. He had once told her. Speak the truth. But never forget who is listening. But he had never taught her how to speak the truth without wounding someone with it. And now, in that heavy silence, another father, wordless, motionless, was showing her what it meant. James tried to reclaim the tempo, his voice trembling slightly. We'll now move on to the next segment. The words hung uselessly in the air. Nobody protested. But no one was truly listening. Because Bill, simply by standing, had become the gravity of the room. He didn't speak. Didn't shake his head. Didn't offer critique. But his silence had drawn something out of each person. Something they'd carried quietly, buried deeply. Caroline pressed her hand gently to her chest for a moment, then let it fall. She looked at Jasmine. No fury in her gaze. No pardon either. Only a quiet acknowledgement, as if to ask, can you really meet my eyes now? Jasmine inhaled slowly, unsure whether to speak or withdraw. She wasn't panicked, just emptied. Bill remained still. He made no move toward the spotlight. He made no gesture to leave. He merely stood, his eyes fixed, his silence charged with meaning. It didn't accuse. It didn't demand. It simply was. The room wasn't watching a show anymore. They had become part of a living moment. Not scripted, not rehearsed. A moment unguarded. True. Weighty. People began glancing at one another, unsure how to carry what was being offered. Not in words, but in presence. Again, the assistant whispered into James's ear. Still, nothing moved. The lens stayed locked, unflinching. Holding Bill's image like a painting that demanded to be studied. And everyone who looked saw not just him. They saw themselves reflected back. Jasmine glanced sideways at Caroline. The tension had dissolved, not by apology, but by gravity. No longer enemies, just two women reckoning with the same silence. And in that sliver of recognition, Jasmine recalled a memory, dim but vivid. Her father, long ago, had said, "Say what's right. But know who hears it." Yet he had left unspoken how to shape truth so it didn't draw blood. Now this other father, this silent figure in gray, was showing her the lesson. James tried once more to bridge the moment. His voice wavered. "Let's turn now to the second half of the program." The words fell flat. No one stirred. No one followed. Because the rhythm of the broadcast no longer came from its script. The tempo had been seized by something deeper. Caroline's voice returned. "I thought I knew my father, until one evening, my mother told me how people used to call him uneducated. Just a builder. Despite working for 30 years to keep our family together. No interruption. No dramatic music." The camera panned toward her naturally. No effects. No spotlight changes. "He never told me that himself. I heard it at the dinner table. I asked him, 'Why didn't you ever tell me?' And he said, 'Because I didn't want you to carry bitterness. I wanted you to carry light.'" A soft exhale moved through the audience. Someone bowed their head. Not from sadness alone, but from understanding. Not because it stirred outrage, but because it felt like a memory everyone had once carried, finally spoken aloud. Caroline slowed, not hesitantly, but to allow the room to absorb what had already arrived. "I used to think my father was too stern, maybe too unyielding. But when I was 16, I saw him stand alone at a land use hearing. He was the only one without influence in that room. And yet, he did not falter. He didn't retract a single word." She paused, her gaze softening as if tracing the moment. "I asked him later, 'Weren't you scared?' He smiled and told me, 'I'm not afraid of their silence. I'm afraid of my own.'" In that moment, Caroline was no longer a politician. She wasn't campaigning. She wasn't defending a stance. She was simply recounting a truth. A memory so personal it stretched into the hearts of those who had believed they were just spectators. Jasmine leaned forward, barely. Her face had no armor now. No rebuttal poised. Her eyes, at last, were no longer focused inward. Caroline continued, voice even, almost reverent. "When I stepped into politics, my father didn't offer congratulations. He said, 'Cruel words won't wound you. The ones that sound like no one's listening will.'" Then she turned toward the camera. Not as a performer. Not as a speaker. As a daughter. Today, someone spoke of opportunity as if it were a punchline. But remember, every jest has its listener. And sometimes, the listener is someone who never speaks aloud. A quiet ripple moved through the room. Not noise. Just stillness reshaping itself. People sat up straighter. Some nodded. Not in agreement. But as if something long restrained had finally found its breath. No one rushed to excuse Jasmine. No one applauded Caroline. But something had changed. Not with declarations, but with perception. James lifted his head, eyes scanning the space. The script lay untouched. He didn't need it. Sometimes the things that matter most, he said, his voice steady, aren't questions at all. Jasmine said nothing. She tilted her head, as if listening again to the story that had just unfolded. A story she hadn't expected to feel. And maybe now did. Bill remained upright. And for the first time that evening, his lips shifted slightly. A hint of a smile. Not one of pride. Not of relief. But of recognition. He had heard. He had seen. And something in him softened, just enough to be known. In that moment, American Currents was no longer a broadcast. It had become a truer reflection of the country it aimed to capture. A place where things unspoken finally emerged, not with anger, but with weight. Caroline said no more. She looked downward, her lashes catching light. And then, as if for herself, she repeated her father's words. He's not afraid of their silence. He's afraid of his own. This wasn't policy. This wasn't persuasion. It was a story. And each line of it mirrored back into the hearts of those who'd once thought, this doesn't concern me. Jasmine turned slowly, no sharp edge, no recoil. Only a quiet willingness to be present. To listen. To hold something without shaping it into her own. Caroline added only one more echo from earlier. My father said. You won't be hurt by cruelty. You'll be hurt by indifference disguised as conversation. And then, to the lens. Today, a remark was made in jest. But jokes always land. And sometimes, the audience is someone who carries silence like history. The room did not erupt. It realigned. Heads lifted. Eyes met. And for the first time in that hour, there was no need to perform. No one apologized. No one sought to redeem. But the shape of the space had altered. Not by blame. But by a shared awakening. James Whittaker finally spoke, without glance to cue cards. His voice low, reflective. Some truths don't need to be defended. They just need to be heard. Caroline gave the faintest nod. Not assent. But acknowledgement. Of the room. Of Jasmine. And Jasmine, in turn, leaned forward. Not to confess. But to receive. To receive a moment that was no longer hers. But included her all the same. Bill Levitt stood unmoving. Then finally, quietly. He sat. No applause followed. No closing cue. Just the stage lights dimming, as if they too understood the hour had passed through something sacred. When he lowered himself into his seat, the room settled with him. No one needed to be told to be quiet. Silence was the only appropriate language left. Jasmine leaned back in her chair. She did not speak again. James began to transition, softly, carefully, into the next topic. But everyone knew. The rhythm of the show now came from somewhere else. Caroline spoke one final time. I once believed I knew who my father was. But one night, over dinner, my mother told me how he'd been called ignorant. Just a laborer. After 30 years of sacrifice for our family. The studio remained hushed. He never told me himself. I asked him why. He said, I didn't want you to carry bitterness. I wanted you to carry light. A gentle breath moved through the audience. Someone lowered their gaze. Not in sorrow. But in recognition. They understood. And later. No headlines flared. No instant virality. 12 hours passed. A student of journalism uploaded the segment to a modest channel. No clever caption. Just the moment itself. Shared not for effect. But because pain had been spoken without asking for pity. Then another post surfaced. From a white father in Virginia. I used to laugh at just jokes. Now I teach my son never to say one without knowing who's listening. The video began to spread. Not like wildfire. But like a whisper passed hand to hand. Town to town. On Reddit, one viewer called it the moment privilege remembered it was visible. And someone else simply wrote, he stood. And after that, we never saw Jasmine the same way again. The major news outlets didn't pick it up immediately. But one late-night program dedicated a rare moment of silence, replaying only the instant Bill Levitt rose to his feet. And then, just as quietly, sat back down. No narration. No music. No caption. Just presence. In a high school classroom in Seattle, a sociology teacher played the clip. There was no discussion. No essay to be graded. Only a handwritten question passed out afterward. What gives someone the power to change an entire room without a single word? Most students wrote, because he was a father. One responded, because he apologized without ever blaming. Another wrote, because it was the first time I saw an ordinary man not asked how he felt, but watched because of how he made others feel. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett disappeared from view. Not because she was condemned. Not because she was praised. But because, for the first time, she chose not to speak. No press tour. No televised clarifications. Her team released only one line. Jasmine is taking time for reflection and family. No one could say if it was strategy or sincerity. But she didn't say her words were misunderstood. She allowed them to echo, however they might be received. Some said she hadn't changed. Others believed that saying nothing further was, in itself, a shift. Caroline Levitt never revisited the show publicly. But 3 days later, she shared a single photograph. Not a selfie. Not a media shot. It was a candid image taken backstage. Her father, alone, beneath a flickering hallway light. No aides. No phone. Just his silhouette, quiet and silver-haired. Her caption read, he doesn't need to be believed. He only needs to be seen. The photo didn't trend. But it was printed and pinned to the wall of a principal's office in Philadelphia. A woman once teased by her students for having a whispery voice. She wrote beneath it in soft pen, I don't need to be loud to lead. I only need to stay quiet long enough for them to hear the emptiness in their own noise. In a small Alabama church, a pastor included the story in his sermon. Grace doesn't come from the one who speaks the truth. It comes from the one who stays silent, and still leads you to do right. Even in politics, where every syllable is sharpened. Where performance is doctrine. A new phrase began to circulate, used with quiet reverence. Someone stood up. No explanation needed. And everyone knew exactly whom they meant. There was no party assigned to him. No label. Just the memory. Jasmine didn't issue an apology. But later, on a podcast, when asked, do you regret anything this year? She paused for 3 full seconds. Then said, I wish I had realized a father was in that audience. And that not every line has to become a joke just because I'm the first one to laugh. No applause followed. But no one moved on quickly either. At a TEDx event in Colorado, a student walked onto the stage and said, I don't want to grow up always needing to be right. I want to be the kind of person who knows when to stop. Maybe someone in the room had heard those words before. But that night, someone finally saw them. There was no chant of Caroline the victor. No judges. No scorecards. Only a joke that had ended. And a room that no longer stood the same. No cheers. No closing anthem. People simply rose from their chairs. Not to celebrate. But to reflect. To remember those whose voices never had to rise. Because their silence echoed far more deeply. Backstage, another photo surfaced. Caroline, seated alone. No phone in hand. No staff nearby. Just her, quietly looking down at the crumpled notes once scattered across the table. Like fragments of a past she no longer needed to defend. No one knew what she was thinking. Except for the photographer, a freshman journalism student. who later captioned it. I used to believe strength meant never being wrong. But last night, I met someone strong enough to know when they were. The following week, no op-eds praised Caroline. No campaign used her words. But across college campuses, law schools, and teacher lounges, a new phrase passed between conversations. It was just a joke. No longer carried weight. No longer passed unquestioned. People stopped ending speeches, debates, or comedy with "just kidding." No one told them to. They simply stopped. At a small bookstore in Chicago, a printed image of Bill standing quietly was taped behind the cash register. No caption. No branding. When asked why, the shop owner shrugged and said, "Because I want people to pause before they speak." A week later, on another network, a pundit attempted to recycle the old joke. About youth, about merit, about opportunity handed out like candy. The host interrupted him, gently but firmly. "We've learned better. That one doesn't belong in the humor segment anymore." The guest fell silent. The energy in the studio shifted. Not in anger, but in awareness. Because for the first time, someone chose not to let it pass. Jasmine Crockett did not return to the spotlight with a prepared speech. She did not reframe the event. She simply kept working. But a small ritual emerged. At the end of each public hearing, she began to close her notebook. Pause. And lift her eyes. Holding her gaze across the room for a few seconds before standing. She never explained it. But those who had watched American Currents knew what it meant. She was making space. Just enough for others to hear their own voices before she spoke again. In an anonymous memo, circulated through a nonprofit office in Boston, someone typed quietly, "Progress isn't always made by who speaks the loudest. Sometimes it begins when someone decides not to go further." And though people stopped quoting Jasmine's words, they kept remembering the man who stood. To a 12-year-old student in Arizona, the child of an immigrant laborer, a letter arrived at Caroline Levitt's office. "You didn't yell, but I could tell you were upset. And so was I. Thank you for not arguing. I don't think staying quiet is the best way to defend yourself." But in that silence, something happened. Something changed. And in that hush, another video began to circulate. From behind the scenes. Backstage, just before the taping, Caroline sat beside her father. She leaned close, whispered, "If I don't say anything, will you be disappointed?" Bill placed his hand gently over hers and smiled. "You don't have to say a word. Those who truly listen will hear the silence. One broadcast. One line. One man who stood. One woman who didn't need to win to shift an entire room's consciousness." The story didn't spread through outrage. It rippled because of the strength of restraint. Because of what wasn't said. On online forums, people began sharing personal reflections. A woman in Ohio posted, "I used to laugh with friends when they joked about low-hanging fruit for today's youth. Now I wonder who I dismissed without realizing." A college student in Boston wrote, "Bill's silence reminded me of my grandfather. He worked his whole life and was never asked what he thought." An elementary teacher in Miami used the story in class. She told her students about the man who changed a room without raising his voice. Most of them drew him. A quiet figure standing with a hammer pin on his lapel. One child captioned their sketch, "He was strong because he didn't shout." In Detroit, a community group hosted a discussion. When silence speaks louder than words. They watched the moment Bill rose. And afterward, no one left. Not out of duty, but because something sacred had occurred and deserved to be honored. Jasmine returned to her work. But her tone had changed. During speeches, she began pausing. Question marks trailing key statements. As if inviting thought instead of applause. She never named American Currents. But others noticed. She was listening more, asking less. Caroline, in time, became White House press secretary. And in interviews, she began referencing her father. Not to correct a public record, but to speak about the dignity of effort. When a journalist asked her what had shifted, she replied, "I learned the audience isn't just the one clapping. It's the one that never says a word." At an education conference in San Francisco, the phrase "someone stood up" opened the keynote. We don't need to win arguments. We need to be present. In New Orleans, an activist designed shirts with 3 words. Hear the silence. It wasn't a campaign. It wasn't monetized. It just resonated. A reminder that humor can wound, and stillness can restore. A month later, an independent filmmaker released a short film. No dialogue, no narration. Just a man rising, standing in silence. It premiered at a festival in Austin. When it ended, the audience stood. Not because the story concluded, but because something had begun. The narrative of Jasmine Crockett's offhand remark, of Caroline Leavitt's quiet endurance, of Bill standing without uttering a word, had grown into a national mirror. In the United States of 2025, where division runs deep and words often strike sharper than intended, this moment reached through. Jasmine's comment, meant as satire, landed instead on a scar. A father's silence, and a daughter's story of years in her father's shadow, compelled a country to pause. Jasmine didn't explain herself. But later, during a podcast, when asked, "Any regrets this year?" she took a breath and said, "I wish I'd noticed there was a father in the room. And that not every line needs to be a punchline. Just because I'm the first to laugh." There was no applause. But no one changed the subject either. At a TEDx event in Colorado, a high school student stood and declared, "I don't want to grow up always being right. I want to be the person who knows when to stop." Because someone in that audience had likely heard words like those before, but never seen someone live them. No one chanted Caroline's name. No awards were issued. No victory speeches. Just a world that paused. That stood up not in celebration, but in reconsideration. In a quiet photo taken backstage, Caroline was seen alone. No phone. No staff. Just her eyes lowered to the notes once spread before her like broken glass. Only the photographer, a freshman journalism student, added a caption. "I thought strength meant never backing down. Last night I saw strength in someone who was willing to listen instead." No op-eds lauded her. No campaign banners quoted her words. But in classrooms, in law offices, in community centers, a single phrase began circulating. Spoken not with irony, but with intention. "It's just a joke." No longer said as it once was. Those who used to dismiss or soften hard truths with a "just kidding" began to leave it off. No one instructed them. They just stopped. At a small bookstore in Chicago, a photo of Bill standing was taped behind the counter. No sign. No fanfare. When asked, the owner simply said, "Because I want people to be quiet for a second before they speak." A week later, on another talk show, a guest began to retell an old, tired joke. One about youth, about opportunity handed out too easily. But the host, without fanfare, cut him off. "We've learned something. That one doesn't belong in comedy anymore." The guest paused. And the tone shifted. Not from anger, but from awareness. Jasmine never published a post about that moment. She gave no recap. But after each meeting, she began closing her notebook, then lifting her eyes. 3 seconds. Just 3. A pause before she left the room. She never said why. But those who had been in the American Currents audience knew. She was leaving space. Just enough. so others could hear themselves again. In an internal memo at a nonprofit in Boston, someone wrote anonymously,